met Babaji there for the first time, and Babaji asked him to write to show the essential unity between religions East and West. Now that's quite a task, but he took on that task and he wrote this, what I consider a deep scripture, a scripture that is not something of, you might say, belief. It's not something based on faith. It's a direct perception of truth by a great master. And it's uncompromising in many ways because he states very deep truths, esoteric truths, and he doesn't explain tremendously. He just, this is the facts, you could say, of how spirit descends into matter, and our individual goal as souls participate in that, and through that descent of spirit into matter, each individual soul incarnated, brought down into spirit, has a divine duty and a divine purpose in life to retrace those footsteps of reclaiming one's divinity in spirit. And he gives the steps by which this happens. Now, I will admit, and I think all of you who have read the Holy Science, and I hope all of you have, that it's a very difficult scripture to understand. But we get glimpses. There are sections of it that are less obscure, but the descent of spirit into matter is something that cannot intellectually be understood only with the mind. We have to understand it with inspiration. We have to understand it with the intuition, and we have to attune ourselves to the consciousness, you could say, to a great master such as Swami Sri Yukteswar to truly understand it. But I have read the Holy Science many times over the years, and each time I'm amazed at what I don't know, I don't understand. And I put the book aside and I come back perhaps a year, 2 years, 3 years later, and I read it again. And slowly, I begin to have a feeling for an understanding. Not in its entirety. Even Master said it's very deep. He hardly understood many of the philosophical concepts that were being explained in the Holy Science. But yet you can feel the vibration, the depth of it. But what I would like to explore in this series of classes is not a book study and not going through the book, looking at trying to explain those obscure points of the descent of spirit into matter, but rather, why did Swami Sri Yukteswar write this book? What is the purpose for us? How does it have meaning for us as devotees and for us on this particular spiritual path of self-realization? And also, he does go quite clearly state certain principles of living, how to live naturally in this life, and the steps that all of us are taking on the spiritual path and moving ultimately toward our ultimate liberation as individual souls. And so as I've read this scripture over the years, I've been inspired by particular aspects of it. And those are the points that I would like to share, my inspiration with what I've gleaned from this very deep book. Now, I'm not going to go step by chapter in the book. And I enjoin you or ask you to read the book yourself. It's available at any most metaphysical bookstores, or you can write to Ananda Sangha, Ananda Publications, and you can order a book and keep it on your bookshelf. It's one of those books I think you'll find that you'll take it off the bookshelf, read it, and then perhaps, that was more than I can understand, and then put it back on, and then you'll bring it down again and again. And over the years, perhaps as in my case, over the decades, slowly it becomes a very beloved companion on your bookshelf. So let's dive in. And the first question that comes to mind is Swami Sri Yukteswar starts the Holy Science before he gets into the very first chapter. In his introduction, he devotes most of that introduction to an explanation of the theory of yugas. And I know many of you have perhaps even gone into a study of the yugas, but certainly if you've been on this path of self-realization, a disciple of this path, you've heard of the yugas. And this tradition of the Yugas is explained in amongst all of our masters by Swami Sri Yukteswar. He himself was he was a Gyan Yogi par excellence, but he was also very much a Vedic astrologer as well. And so the cycles of time were something that he had studied. And he had claimed, he made the claim that the traditional understanding of the Yugas as understood in India and in Vedic astrology in India is wrong. That a error had crept into the system. Now, I'm not going to explain the Yuga theory in terms of the mechanics of it. And this is what I ask you to read the introduction of the Holy Science, because this is not what this class is about. I'm assuming that you have some understanding of that. And it's easily found because it's not many pages, a dozen pages or so in the introduction. But he begins his book with this introduction of the Yugas to set it as a background against which he is going to then present the rest of his teachings. And if we want to understand, as I've come to realize, I wondered, at first when I read this, I saw it as something very separate. It was an anomaly, a curiosity, you might say. But as time has gone by, I began to understand that it's a very essential teaching against which we place what Swami Sri Yukteswar taught and what Paramhansa ultimately taking Sri Yukteswar's teachings and presenting them into the world. In order to truly understand Masters, Paramhansa Yogananda's mission and what they were teaching, it's important to understand the context against the background of the teachings of the Yugas, the cycles of time. And the masters of our path, they emphasize this. And you could say this study of the Yugas and this understanding of the Yugas, in order for us to realize, understand the path of yoga as taught by Master, is somewhat unique to our path. I don't believe it's taught anywhere else except in this tradition of self-realization. But it's core as to why our teachings had been presented into the world at this time, and for us to really be able to see why perhaps some of the things that have been taught that Master Paramhansa Yogananda brought into the world, why he did so. And so if we understand it in that way, we'd say, now I understand. It's particular to our tradition, but to understand it, why Master presented his teachings the way he did, it's because of the fact that what Swami Sri Yukteswar is saying is that we as a society, as a civilization, as a world, we have entered into a new age. Now it's common in common parlance, the new age, theory of the new age. That phrase has been bandied about very casually, and I think in society as a whole. It's because there's a sense that, and even modern society as a whole that are not in the path of yoga, has some inkling, some sense that yes, it is a new age. There's something different. Certainly the 20th century is very, very different than the 19th. 19th was a bit different from the 18th, but there is a change that is taking place that is accelerating. And if we look back, we can see this acceleration of change, especially within the last 3 or 4 centuries, has dramatically, you might say, is dramatically been different than what preceded it. We have entered, as the masters have said, we have entered a new age particularly characterized by the age of energy, that there is a quickening of understanding. There's a quickening of awareness. And in his book, Swami Sri Yukteswar explains why that quickening is taking place. It's because of various cosmic forces that of our solar system in the larger galaxy in which we're rotating in this galaxy. And as we move closer to the center of that galaxy, there's a wave of energy coming from the heart of the galaxy, cosmic forces, that enlivens understanding, enlivens consciousness, enlivens awareness on the earth. And so, in a passive sense, mankind, just by the fact that we are in this upward flow of greater awareness taking place, the awareness of individuals incarnated in this day and age, are also increased, that awareness increased. And I have to just casually, I look at people being born now, and I think, young people seem to be much more aware than I was when I was their age. Now, I thought that may be very subjective and a generalization because it's not always true for everybody, but it seems so. People seem to understand things very intuitively that I was somewhat, I didn't understand. Although on a soul level, I don't necessarily, I understood things on a soul level, perhaps that was unique to me. But a general upliftment, a general awakening to realities is taking place very slowly. This yugas, the passage of time, are very long rhythms. But it's hopeful in the sense, as compared to the old understanding of the cycles of time. The traditional view would be that we are in Kali Yuga, an age that goes for hundreds of thousands of years, and that we're, you might say, doomed to be in this age of Kali, which is an age of darkness, an age of where awareness is obscured. We're doomed to be in this, incarnated in mankind in this for hundreds of thousands of years. And Swami Sri Yukteswar would say, no, that's not true. The cycle of the ages is much shorter than that, and that we have now entered into this what's called Dwapara Yuga. And the teachings of self-realization that have been presented by our masters are teachings that are specifically attuned and have come into the world at this time because of this movement of the world at large, society at large, into this new age of energy, which is known as Dwapara. Dwapara Yuga formally began, you could say we had moved from Kali Yuga into Dwapara Yuga roughly around the year 1700. And we had, plus or minus a little bit, but we had moved into Dwapara Yuga fully around 1900. That an age of great scientific awakening in terms of physics and Einstein and relativity. And there are certain characteristics of Dwapara Yuga that you can see manifested, a world of energy, a world of greater understanding. And this is what Swami Sri Yukteswar wanted to emphasize and wanted to make people aware, because it's a message of great hope. It's a message also of challenge, because when moving into a new age, it's hopeful in the sense that we are in a consciousness is awakening. And so that very by its nature gives a certain sense of purpose, a sense of awakening. And it's also a sense that we are ascending. And by writing as at Babaji's command, by writing the Holy Science, he outlines the stages by which this awakening takes place, and he projects into the future the inevitable stages which each soul will ultimately pass through if they make the effort to do so. And so consequently, when I first read about this, I thought, this is fantastic. There's a purpose to life. It confirms my own inner feeling, intuition, that there has to be meaning to life. And through the Holy Science, Swami Sri Yukteswar lays out, you could say, the foundation and the steps by which consciousness ultimately descended into matter and by which it ultimately finds its release. Now that to me was a very hopeful message. But it's also, I would say, this is a time of change. It's a time of challenge. And why is that? It's been my observation that people often will express a desire to change. They think, oh, that's great, I want to change. But it's also been my observation that most people resist change. They don't really like it. They think they do, but when it actually happens, they don't. Because we tend to be attached to the status quo. Because change means I'm going to have to give up this, and some new thing is coming. It's a new challenge. It's that old saying, I believe it's an Asian, Chinese perhaps. It's a blessing and a curse to be born in a time of change. May you be born in a time of change, because it's opening a lot of new opportunities, but it's also a curse because we have to adapt to those changes. And to the degree that we are open to change, to the degree that we, you might say, get on board and attune ourselves with those changes, we find that our life can prosper. We find that we can find happiness in life. We can find that we can grow. But on the other hand, if we approach change as we're being uprooted, it can be very difficult because we become attached. And I think whenever you find yourself in a time of change, there's also going to be forces that resist that change. And I think this is what we are seeing in the world today. The world is changing very fast, whether mankind wants it or not. There are forces way beyond our control that are causing this to happen. And to the degree that we go with it and adapt, we can be like the surfer on the waves, riding the waves of change. But there's always going to be this resistance to it. No, I don't want to change. I want the good old days of the past. And it's threatening to us. And yes, sometimes some of the change is chaotic. And some of the change is not necessarily attuned to what is trying to happen for the future. But you have this tumult. And I think in society as a whole, we're seeing this tumult manifested right now. But the potential, I think, is very exciting for the future. And Swami Sri Yukteswar in his writing, he gives us a bit of a glimpse of what that change might be. He says, in the coming age of Dwapara, which you must understand, we've just entered into the very beginnings of it, and it will extend. This age of Dwapara is said to extend for about 2,000 years, 2,400 years into the future. It was quite a long time. Most people can't think nearly that much. We have one little lifetime of 60, 70, 80 years is hardly a blip on the screen of that. So Dwapara in and of itself is going to take time, but life passes quite quickly. And during this time of change, we're going to see society itself under the influence of a general quickening of awareness begin to conform and express itself in new ways. He said, in the ages to come, this age of energy, mankind will become aware of subtler energies in this world and begin to harness them. Now, think of him writing this in 1894, 1895, right at the turn of the century there. Electricity was just new on the horizon. Electricity had only come into you might say a discovery, awareness of electricity in the 100 years prior to that. So electricity had now become one of those subtle energies, which Paramhansa Yogananda said is actually, I have a little aside here. I once wrote Swami Kriyananda. I said, what is electricity anyway? And as he was speaking along these veins, and he said, Master Yogananda had said, electricity is the animal current of the astral world. In other words, a very low energy. It's an astral entity. It's an astral phenomena. It's not a physical phenomena. It's an astral phenomena. And that it's the animal current, which implies that it's a very base level. Swami Sri Yukteswar said that during the coming millennia, will become familiar with deeper realities of energy. Perhaps he was speaking of pranic forces that we will become aware of and be able to manipulate. That technology, of course, will become much more subtle an understanding, less gross. Think of medicine. Think of a medicine of 100 years ago in the 19th century medicine, very crude. Think of medicine in the 20th century. We think of it as very, very modern. But think of what it might be 100 years from now, 200 years from now, much more refined than it is now. Looking back on today, it's going to seem today's approach to medicine is going to be considered very crude. And so you're going to find in science and technology a much more refinement taking place. It's going to be less matter-based. If you look, one of the qualities of Kali Yuga is it's very materialistic in terms of matter and form. Energy, you could say, is a higher expression. So it's a more subtle, it's flowing, it's creative. And so you're going to find that things are going to shift in the technological world, in the scientific world, but also in you could say sociologically as well as politically. You're going to see these changes begin to take place. Master Paramhansa Yogananda, he said that in the age to come, there's going to be the boundaries between countries will begin to dissolve. Instead of thinking of ourselves as separate races, separate nations, separate languages, separate cultures, we're going to see ourselves as more of a one world, expressed in many different ways. The unity underneath will come to the forefront, whereas the divisiveness that we see now expressed will begin to recede. And again, these forces you could see very subtly are taking place even in the political world now. And at the same time, as you find these manifesting, the inevitability of that in the future, it breeds resistance to it. And inevitably, that resistance may manifest itself as warfare even. Because although Dwapara Yuga is a more refined age than the age of Kali from which we've come out of, it's not in itself a highest age. It's a restless stage. It's an age of energy, and energy can be expressed outwardly in a negative way as well. And so, especially in the time of tumult, of passage from one age to the next, it could be very difficult times perhaps we could go through. But inevitably there is a direction to this at this particular time in history, an upward movement to greater awareness, ultimately bringing about a sense of unity. And every age needs a particular, this is going to threaten religion. Yeah, I think you could see traditional religion seems to be somewhat, resistant to these sorts of change. This too, the forces will impel religion itself to change and the approach to religion. Swami Sri Yukteswar said this is one of the reasons why Kriya Yoga is being introduced in the world at this time. He said every age needs a sadhana that's particularly helpful to that age. And in the age of in Kali, the particular sadhanas that was available to people were faith, belief, scripture, ritual, and these served very well. But they are not adequate to really satisfy the spiritual longings of people in the next age, this age of Dwapara. This being an age of energy is an age where, and it's a scientific age, an age where humans want experience. They don't just want to believe, they want to experience something for themselves. And so Kriya Yoga has been brought by our masters, by our traditions, as a sadhana for this age of Kali Yuga, because it's based upon the science of energy in the yogic world, the prana, the movement of prana within the body. So Kriya is appropriate for this age. So again, this understanding of the yugas of why our teachings are being presented in the way they are. Why did Master emphasize the energization exercises? Why is this speaking of, when we speak about attitudes, when we speak about uplifting the energy from the base of the spine up to the point between the eyebrows, we're assuming an understanding of inner forces, of inner energy. And this is at the heart of the science of yoga, and particularly the science of Kriya Yoga. So you can see the world is changing technologically, it's changing socially, it's changing politically, and it's changing spiritually. And, you could, I think as people come into it, people are drawn into an age, you could say people incarnate into an age that is attuned to their own consciousness. I remember thinking about this, and this is a little bit of an aside. I was thinking, this is great, and maybe my next life I'll come back and I'll be able to enjoy the benefits of a higher age, and then again and again. Now that was making an assumption that I'm going to come back into this higher age, and many people think that way, but that's not necessarily so. We come back into an age that is attuned for our own benefit to be able to spiritually grow. And there are many people who maintain if one maintains a Kali Yuga mentality of an attachment to form, an attachment to, you might say, the human body, or those aspects of human consciousness that are gross and material, one is reborn into a world that expresses those. We think that this is the only world, and Paramhansa Yogananda emphasized to Swami Kriyananda. He says there are many worlds into which a soul can be reborn, and we are reborn into a world that is in tune with our consciousness. So just because we're on the earth at this particular time in space and cosmic time doesn't mean we're necessarily going to come back here. But those who are attuned to a higher state of consciousness will be born into a higher state of consciousness. And in every age, there are people who express Kali Yuga tendencies, and in every age, there are those who express Treta and Satya Yuga tendencies as well. It's a spectrum, but the predominant feature of this coming 1,000, 2,000, 2,400 years will be those people who are in tune with this age of energy of Dwapara. Now, I've said that this Dwapara Yuga is an age of energy. It's also, on a spiritual level, in terms of human growth, it's also an age of ego. It's an egoic age. It's an age of, and we might think, well, that doesn't sound like it's a very high age, but actually we have to remember that ego is friend and foe. And you could say it's an age of self-will. The ego in Dwapara Yuga is energized, whereas the ego in Kali Yuga was constrained. Society itself, the way it was, self-expression was constrained. There was dynastic control. Individual freedoms were constrained. Monarchy, hereditary, military control, power of the state over the individual. But I think we're going to see, and it's starting to happen already in the last couple centuries, those old forms are being washed away. It's very interesting. Master was born, came in the very first half and lived his life in the first half of the 20th century, a time of tremendous change. You might say colonialism was, when he came in to this life as Paramhansa Yogananda, as Yogananda, Mukundalal Ghosh, India was a colony of a great empire. By the time he passed, that colonialism as a way of international life, as a way of international relations, had completely disappeared. A social structure that had existed for centuries was gone during his lifetime. And expressed on the individual level, the constraints that people were under. Think of slavery was accepted up until not very long ago. The individual was constrained. And we still have elements of this, of course. We're not completely free of Kali Yuga. You might say, although we're in the age of Dwapara, our social memory reaches back into the ages that preceded us, which were actually a little bit darkened by Kali Yuga. So we take those memories and these new things coming in, we sometimes try to fit them into an old mold. But as time goes by in one generation and as the next succeeds one after the other, they no longer fit. And so as I was saying, this is an age where the individual in many ways has been released from those constraints. You could say the ego has been released. Now, newfound freedom is not necessarily expressed in the highest way. And so you see the individual ego, the individual freedom that people in modern society they aspire to. Nobody wants to be bound any longer. That's an old social form. They don't necessarily express that freedom in the highest way. So the ego, you could say, is released from the chains of bondage in the past, but it's not necessarily enlightened. It has freedom to express itself for good or for evil, but yet you give energy to something and it does tend toward chaos until it finally organizes itself. And we're in that stage right now where it's a very egoic age. Dwapara Yuga itself is said to be an egoic age. And one of the lessons of Dwapara Yuga will be learning to harness the ego in a positive direction. It is, you might say, it begins every man for himself, express oneself, get what is mine, and satisfy that ego. And we begin to learn the lesson that wouldn't I be happier if I expanded that sense of little self to include other people in my aura of who and what I am? And we find it's my sense, and I think this is, we'll come back to it later in the Holy Science, I think confirmed by Swami Sri Yukteswar, that one of the lessons of Dwapara Yuga in this next 2,000 years will be society learning to turn self-interest into enlightened self-interest. The little ego of me and mine, only for myself, comes to learn that by helping others, by expanding my sense to help others, I am the ultimate beneficiary in that. Now, that in itself is not necessarily the highest state, but it certainly is a state higher than we're in right now, to see my neighbor as myself. And by helping my neighbor, I help myself. By one nation helping another nation, breaking down those boundaries, I help myself. By gathering together with others, I help my little self. I grow. This is what Paramhansa Yogananda defined as the social way to God. The expansion of sympathies from me and mine and my little family into including others into my family, and ultimately my neighbors, my larger sense of family, ultimately my town, my village, my nation, they're all included in my family, my larger family, and to make that a reality of our understanding. Now, if that is so, does that not give us a clue as to why Paramhansa Yogananda emphasized this concept of communities when he did? Now, this is right at the very beginning of this age. And he, of course, made an effort at his retreat facility in Encinitas to start the community, but it didn't work. It fell, it was abandoned, the effort was abandoned, but he planted the seeds in his disciples. And one disciple particularly took that up, and that was Swami Kriyananda, who vowed to make that vision of communities a reality in his lifetime. And out of that, Ananda Village and the concept of intentional communities took root. And again, this is at the very beginning of a Dwapara Yuga, but this is a very Dwapara Yuga concept, which, as Master said and predicted, this concept of community will spread like wildfire in the age to come. Now, is that my lifetime? Probably not, because I don't have much left. But is it in your lifetime, those of you who are in your 20s or 30s? Maybe, if you choose to make it so. But even if it's not, if it's only ones and twos or threes or fours here and there, in the age to come, this idea of working together that will bring ultimately happiness to each one of us. High thinking and plain living lead to the highest happiness, is what Paramhansa Yogananda said. So if you think of it in this way, you can understand it's the context in which Paramhansa Yogananda was speaking. He was introducing these concepts at a time. And as I said earlier, I find this book to be a great hope, because there is a directional purpose, a positive upward in terms of greater awareness, greater expansion of consciousness taking place. And we begin by studying the holy science, we begin to see our place in this unfoldment of consciousness. This, you might say, we get more of a cosmic view of what is taking place here in this larger world mission that is taking place. A new sadhana has come in, a new ways of relating to people have come in. Religion itself is expressing itself in new ways, and belief instead of, or experience instead of belief is coming. And all of these hold out great promise for us. And through studying or reading and understanding the holy science, we begin to see this context of how we ourselves will be able to participate in that. And so in the weeks to come, I'd like to extract certain elements from the holy science of how we might attune ourselves to that flow that is taking place. Because remember, there is a cosmic flow. It's whether now my individual effort is to harmonize with that larger flow. But that flow is like there. It's like the wind. If we raise our sail to catch the wind, we can make great spiritual progress. But if we ignore it, in a sense, we miss that opportunity and we remain stuck in old ways of thinking. And of course, as we incarnate again and again, we find ourselves drawn to those worlds that are in tune with the consciousness that we have when we pass from this world. And so let's make this a fun study. And as we go forward in the weeks to come, what I'm going to do, and I'm not going to do it this week, but I would like to, generally our classes will be for 45 minutes. The first half hour, I'd like to speak about a topic that has inspired me, and then I'd like to open it up to questions and answers. You can, and of course, if you have any, I'm not doing that this week just to get started, but if there's any questions, please send them in in the chat box to Barakil, and he'll take them and hand them to me, and you can do that for this week too. You can send them in to Barakil, and I will then answer them, or at least one or two or a few of them next week. And of course, questions that come up next week, you can write them into the chat box, and we'll dedicate the last portion of each class to answering questions and anything of a particular interest that you have. But all I ask is that you address your questions to the topic that we're speaking about that week, and then I think it'll help broaden the discussion. And so until next week, let's come back, and you could say this week was a bit of an introduction about the background, the context, Dwapara Yuga, the Yugas. Read that introduction of the Holy Science to fully understand what it is that I'm speaking about. I think most of you have, but reread it because it's well worth the effort. And so I look forward to speaking with you once again next week. God bless all of you. Joy to you.